Tell me, here's my understanding of what your new piece is. In this journal, the back half are the social indicators, the front half is an essay authored by Brad. And my understanding of what you wrote is that in middle America, marriage is in trouble.
Right.
There's about 58% of adults in America today who are what you might call, or what you do call, the moderately educated middle, those folks who have a high school degree and maybe some college, but not a college degree. So they're the high school educated folks, about 58%. And the marriage trends among those young people, those adults, are now increasingly resembling those of the poor, with higher rates of divorce, higher rates of cohabitation, higher rates of out-of-wedlock childbearing. And by contrast, those who are college educated have marriage kind of indicators that are doing as well, if not maybe better than they have in the recent past. So there's kind of a divergence there. Do I have that about right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. But I also want to, before we kind of begin our conversation, just to extend my thanks to you and to all the staff at the Institute who have really made this whole possible. This really is a collective effort here, and I can count at least 11 people, most of whom are in this room tonight, who have worked at so many different stages in the process, from exchanging ideas to working on the prose to designing the report, getting it printed and everything else. So it's really been a collective effort, and I'm grateful to the Institute for making this all possible. But yeah, you're right.
It's our pleasure to work with you, so please, yes. Yeah.
So basically, yeah, we're finding there's this dramatic retreat from marriage in middle America. There is, increases in divorce and non-marital childbearing especially. There is declines in marital quality, and that fewer kids in middle American homes are growing up with both their mom and their dad. So this is, a key kind of headline from the report. And was striking looking at the data was just how on every indicator that I came up against, they were sliding in the direction of the pattern that we've seen now for about 4 decades among both the poor and among African Americans. By contrast, the college educated set was doing pretty darn well on both marital quality, on divorce. Their kids are more likely nowadays to be living with mom and dad. So there was a striking pattern where basically the college educated folks are doing quite well on many indicators. And seem to have kind of taken a lesson, if you will, from the sort of fallout of the 60s and 70s and have engaged in kind of a course correction when it comes to marriage. Whereas those Americans who are in this middle strata, as well as poor Americans, have not. And so you can see, like on this particular, figure here, figure 1, there's been a modest uptick in divorce for this middle American group. Whereas for those who are college educated, there's been a decline in the first 10 years of married life. And even more dramatic trends when it comes to non-marital childbearing, where you're seeing just surging non-marital childbearing among this middle group right here, from 13% in 1982 to about 44% today. Whereas for college educated Americans, just a very modest uptick from 2% to 6%. So it's the case that for college educated Americans, non-marital childbearing is still really an exotic activity. And this is just a striking difference that we're seeing here on a number of different indicators in the report.
So when we're talking about college educated people, how many people are we talking about?
So it's about 30% of American adults in our
So I think we
report.
tend to think, a lot of us who read and write about this stuff went to college, and we kind of think this is, that's what most people do, but we're really talking about it's a large minority, but a minority of Americans that have a 4-year college degree.
That's right. So it is still kind of an elite to some degree, and they're behaving in ways that are obviously quite distinctive when it comes to a range of different family indicators.
So you'd say, I know you wrote in the report that for some decades now, marriage has been increasingly fragile among the poor,
Right.
more fragile, weak, more kind of a weakening institution. Are you saying then that there's kind of that those patterns are going up the ladder in some way, that they're starting to be seen now among the moderately educated?
Yeah, so that's obviously kind of a striking takeaway, that we've seen kind of the retreat from marriage for a long time now among the poor and among African Americans, and now that pattern is reaching up into the heart of American life, and that's a key finding from this particular report. And of course, it makes it much more difficult for them to realize their deepest ideals on a number of different fronts: economic, social, and cultural.
Because the desire is still there to have marriage.
That's right. It's also, I think, important for us to realize that despite these differences in marriage patterns, if you look across classes, across race, across ethnicity, Americans of all stripes still aspire to marriage. They think that marriage is the best thing. They want to get married. Nevertheless, when it comes to kind of their actual behavior, there's a gap between their ideals and their behavior, which is what we're seeing in this report.
Yeah. So it seems like part of what you do here is really trying to kind of map out, the marriage, picture today. One of the things that I think is unique about what you've done, though, is you really try to get into the causes as well, kind of where are these trends coming from?
That's right. There's been a lot of focus, and for obvious reasons, in the last few years on the economic causes of this growing marriage gap in American life. And we find that those economic causes are important. But I think one of the new contributions that we make here in this report is to explore the cultural dimensions of this crisis, to kind of understand how there's been a kind of a change in heart in many Americans when it comes to a lot of these marriage-related questions and issues. And more particularly, there's been basically a shift away from a strong mindset, a marriage mindset, among many middle Americans, and interestingly, a shift towards marriage, a sort of a shift towards a marriage mindset among many college-educated Americans. So they're kind of moving in two different directions, which only reinforces a lot of these trends. So for instance, college-educated Americans have become more traditional on premarital sex, whereas middle Americans have become less traditional. On divorce, you're seeing in this figure over here that middle Americans are actually sort of staying the course, although you're seeing a drop-off in a kind of aversion to divorce among the least educated. Only 40% now are averse to divorce in this least educated group, whereas among the college-educated crowd, you're seeing they're moving to a more kind of marriage-friendly view. They're becoming more likely to oppose easy divorce. So this is one example of their sort of shift to a marriage mindset. It's also the case, though, too, particularly when it comes to kind of their own, that is their own relationships and their own kids, that it's this college-educated group that's most likely to take a marriage mindset. And this, I think, is very clear in this particular figure, where we're looking at the percentage of adolescents who report that they would be embarrassed if either they got pregnant or if their girlfriend got pregnant. And what you can see here is that it's the kids from the highly educated homes where mom has a college degree who are the most likely to report that they would be embarrassed, whereas kids from middle America and kids from homes where they're headed by a high school dropout are much more likely to say that they wouldn't be embarrassed. So my point here simply is that kind of regardless of where people stand in the abstract on a host of social questions like abortion, for instance, or same-sex marriage, for the college-educated set, when it comes to their own lives and how they conduct their own lives and their own families, they're much more likely to stress marriage and to stress what Barbara Diffel-Whitehead calls the success sequence of getting educated, getting a job, getting married, and then having kids in that order. And so that's why you see these kinds of trends, and it also explains why, in many important respects, when it comes once again to their own lives, they're living quite conventional family lives at this end of the strata.
So does the economy play into this at all, or is it mostly a cultural thing?
Now, the economy does play an important role here, and we're seeing kind of across the board that middle Americans are becoming disengaged from the institutions of work, of civil society, and of religion in particular. But turning first to the economic question, what we're seeing basically is that middle Americans and the least educated Americans are much more likely to be experiencing spells of unemployment, of underemployment, and they're seeing their wages deteriorate. This is particularly an issue for working class and poor men. It's the men who have been hit hardest by the shifts in our economy. And if you know anything about kind of marriage and money, you know that having a husband who can earn a decent, stable income is really important for both the quality and the stability of a marriage. And when he's not earning money and when he's not holding down a decent job, he's much more likely to be emotionally disengaged from the marriage. And both he and his wife, according to a new study from Stanford, are more likely to head for divorce court. So the point I want to make here is it's not just a cultural question, it's also an economic question here, and that's, I think, pretty clear in this figure, where you can see that, and this is prior to the Great Recession that we're just kind of coming through here, that there was no increase in unemployment for the college-educated men in this particular slide right here, but for both the middle American group and for the downscale group, if you will, there's been a marked increase in spells of unemployment. So what this means is these men are less attractive, both in their own eyes and in their eyes of their partners or of their spouses as providers. And this helps to explain in part why we're seeing this trend unfold here.
And I would guess just some stress too on the marriage of having
Sure,
less
definitely.
income around. And
Stress
stuff.
is, definitely part of the story. Yeah.
And then it was, we've been really gratified to see some of the discussion that your report has sparked in the last day or so since its release on midnight of late Sunday night. New York Times columnist Ross Douthat had a piece yesterday on the report, and he kind of examined, I think, what you might call the third cause or the third dimension of these trends, kind of the increasing secularization and an interesting flip that's going on right now in America.
Right, so on the religious front in particular, what we see is that back in the 1970s, as you can see right here, this middle American group was more likely to attend church on a weekly basis, 40% of them back in the 1970s. Whereas today, this is the green bars, what we see is that the college-educated set is most likely to attend church on a weekly basis. So there's been a kind of reversal where back in the 70s it was the middle American group who was more, in a sense, pious. Whereas today it's this college-educated set who is more likely to be attending church regularly. And this is important because, once again, religion's one of the factors that's strongly linked to marriage. We know that religious institutions foster norms. They plug people into networks, and they give people what I call a nomos in sociology that helps them make sense of their lives in ways that are marriage friendly. So concretely what I mean basically is that they foster, for instance, norms like fidelity, norms like sacrifice, norms like forgiveness that have an impact obviously on people's lives and on their relationships. They also plug people into networks that tend to be more marriage friendly and more marriage centered, and people can get support for their relationships. They can get help when they have a new child, for instance. Many dinners baked for them the first month after the baby comes along or babies come along. And then they also get
a recent father of twins and other children, so you can hear that coming out.
Definitely. So, and then this nomos, this is what Peter Berger calls a nomos. And what Peter Berger means is that religion gives people a sense of, or a sense that the world is meaningful. There's some kind of purpose behind it all. And so particularly when people are facing difficulties, when they're facing the loss of a job, when they're facing the death of a loved one, when they're facing perhaps a child who's got some kind of difficulty of one sort or another, if they have this conviction that God is present in their life and that He has a plan for them, that can actually help them negotiate these difficulties in a more constructive fashion and in a way that's not going to kind of bleed over in a negative manner into their relationship and into their family more generally. So the fact that this group is becoming less connected to religious institutions is yet one more reason why they're becoming also disconnected from marriage itself.
It kind of confounds the conventional wisdom. I mean, I think a lot of us have the assumption that middle America is sort of small towns and church people, and you're saying that something different is happening there, at least among the young marriage age population.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So what we're seeing, I think, here is that in many small town communities, in many outer suburbs, in many rural communities, there's been a kind of a withdrawal from both from religion, from stable employment, and also from civil society more generally. So you're probably all familiar with kind of the Robert Putnam story
right,
about
the
bowling
alone. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. What doesn't come out as clearly in that particular book, but comes out, I think, very clearly in this report, is that the bowling alone story is much more pronounced among this middle American and this high school dropout groups. I mean, they're the ones who are most likely over the last 40 years to be stepping back, not just from religion, but also from more secular forms of civic engagement. And once again, these kinds of developments only reinforce the marriage trends that we're talking about in the report.
Is this sort of increasing disengagement from the institutions of civil society affecting men and women similarly or differently, or is there kind of a gender story there as well?
So I think this issue is most pronounced sort of across the board here for young men in both middle America as well as in many poor communities. They're the ones who are most likely to be unemployed or underemployed. They're the ones who are the least likely to be attending religious services of one stripe or another. So I think the point that I would make here is that it's the men who become the most disengaged from the sort of formative institutions of our society. And when that happens, they're more inclined to engage in mischief of one sort or another. But also, I think, as importantly, they're just not as likely to kind of use their talents in ways that are good for them and for their mates and their children.
So, because obviously if the men are being impacted particularly, then that impacts the women and children as well.
Right, that's right.
We're all connected. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. one of the things that strikes me, when I've been reading your work and thinking about it in the context of the larger issues that are kind of confronting the nation now, and some of the work that we do at the Institute, is this question of the middle class and sort of what does the kind of trends that you're identifying here portend for the future of the middle class. This idea that if you work hard enough, anybody can sort of enter and sustain this sort of sector of society where there's a broad array of shared norms and a real potential for your family to thrive. How does this connect with that story, if at all?
Well, we've been seeing in public opinion polling data recently that more and more Americans are concerned about the future of our country. They're concerned that they're not going to have the same opportunities that their parents and grandparents did. And I think what hasn't been as clearly recognized in many precincts is that these family trends are part and parcel of this larger concern about kind of the fading American dream for many Americans. And that's, I think, an important point to kind of draw out, because we know that adults who get and stay married actually tend to, particularly men, once again, work harder. They tend to work more strategically. They tend to earn more income. They also tend to save more. And all these things make the American dream more, more possible for them. But even more than the adults, we see that kids who are raised in intact homes are more likely to do well in school, to graduate from high school, to graduate from college, and to be stably employed once they're young adults. So they're getting some kind of formation in the home that really increases their odds of succeeding as Americans later in life. So insofar as marriage is in trouble, particularly in middle America, that means that the American dream is also in trouble in middle America.
So in answer to people who might say, well, in an era when jobs and the economy are the biggest concern, why are you concerned about marriage? It's for these kinds of reasons then that you would say that this is where...
Yeah, so I think all of us, would like to have a strong, thriving middle class, and we'd like to have the sense that people in this country can realize their dreams. And when families aren't working, that limits their capacity to realize their dreams. And there's also kind of a takeaway here for both liberals and conservatives. One of the things that we find in the literature on family is that about 41% of the increase in income inequality in the U.S. can be attributed to these changes in American family life. So that's a big, I think, takeaway for progressives or liberals. We also know that from the work done here at the Institute, that there's a big connection between the growth of government and the breakdown of the family. Because when the family breaks down, the state has to step in. You have to have more police, more courts, more welfare, et cetera. And so this whole issue should be of concern also to conservatives who want limited government. Of course, they need to recognize that limited government depends upon fostering citizens who have the capacity for governing their own passions, their own appetites. And it's good families that tend to cultivate those virtues that allow for
self-governance in the home.
Exactly.
Yields good citizens later. At least this is what people have been saying since our founding, I guess, and maybe they were onto something.
Right.
Yeah. So you're saying that some of what your argument connects with this concern about growing inequality in the U.S. You made a interesting kind of comparison to the Latin American model, which you said is where the U.S. could be headed. Can you say more about that?
So one of the striking things, if you look at kind of the history of Latin America, is that there has been a tradition in some countries of really kind of this bifurcated pattern where you have an elite that is powerful, that is privileged, and has strong and stable families. And these three things all work together to kind of reinforce their power, their privilege, and their family stability. That's less so in some countries now than it used to be. Whereas for those people in kind of the middle and particularly the lower strata, they have no power, no privilege, and no stability in their families. And there's been a long tradition in many Latin countries of cohabitation, which just tends to be less stable. So my concern here is that we may be kind of drifting into a kind of Latin model. Of course, that's not conducive to strong political institutions, strong social institutions, and it also makes this sort of middle group, I think, susceptible to kind of a more sort of a kind of, Latin-style dictator, basically. So my concern is that, if the family breaks down, that can also impact the country in ways that we can't, anticipate.
Yeah, I understand that you don't want to hammer home kind of the Latin American idea, but just it's an interesting experiment to think about.
Right.
Yeah. When I was thinking about all of us coming together this evening, and Brad and I know each other well and worked together for a number of years now on projects, and it seems like a nice opportunity also just to kind of engage with one another as human beings. And one question I thought about asking Brad was kind of, you could have done anything, many things, I'm sure, in your professional work, and even in the field of sociology, a great deal of choices there. Why marriage? What was it about marriage that drew you, and has it sustained your interest for this many years?
Well, I was raised by a single mom, and I think that she did a pretty good job. But I realized growing up and not having a father in the home that there was a real, sort of hole in my soul, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of realization led me, as a college student at the University of Virginia, to think about kind of, what are the institutions in our society that really connect kids to their fathers. And as I thought through this issue, and as I followed people like David Blankenhorn, I came to the conclusion that marriage is really that institution, above any other, that connects, men to their kids. And that if I want more kids to grow up in a home with their father, then it would be helpful to do work that's related really to the institution of marriage, because it's such an important thing that communities across religion, across time and space have come across this institution in their own ways, and that connects kids to their dads.
So studying marriage as an institution is kind of the core question for you, is sort of one of fatherhood and parents and children. And
Right, that's right. Yeah.
Well, here's kind of, I think that was a fair question. Here's kind of an unfair question, and one that gets tossed at me a lot. What should we do about all this? Okay, say somebody picks up your report and they agree with you, then what?
I think we have to accept the fact that there's no silver bullet here, and I think that there's no Republican or Democratic solution either. We have to recognize that we're looking at obviously profound economic challenges facing many middle American and poor communities. We're looking at the erosion of a strong marriage culture in our society. We're looking at declines in our religious and civic life. So we have to kind of look at how we can address those all in a kind of discrete fashion. But let me give you kind of some concrete examples of how we might address this. So one example would be kind of posed at the religious community. And if you go to a college, if you attend a college, you will encounter religious ministries, Catholic, Jewish, Muslim, Protestant, etc. Whereas if you're graduating from high school in American life and moving on to a job, working for Ford or whatever else it might be, there's no equivalent ministry for you. And yet most of our young adults are not going on to get a four-year college degree. So I think just as a practical matter, what we could think about is ways in which religious institutions could reach out to this non-college educated group and be more intentional about kind of bringing them from adolescence into adulthood in a religious context. That would be kind of one concrete idea. But I think also in terms of thinking about policy issues, revisiting divorce reform, because divorce tends to really undercut the next generation's faith in marriage. And if we can kind of make divorce more fair and more just, that may strengthen their faith in marriage. It also will reduce the incidence of divorce. But most of the solutions that we're going to need to advance are not going to come from Washington. They're not going to come from Albany. Because I think that the most powerful force in a lot of this stuff is really coming from Hollywood and from Madison Avenue. And that if we want to really make changes in our society on this particular issue of marriage, we need to figure out ways in which we can make marriage more appealing in the public's imagination.
Yeah.
So.